every day you and I get bombarded with negative news. Just like the body becomes what we eat, the mind becomes what we're putting in. It is important to listen to stories that not only gives you hope, but also inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we're interviewing experts who will break down the solutions to the world's most pressing problems. And I promise you, if you listen to this podcast, you will not only stay informed, but you will also feel more energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Today, Great.com talks with Founders Pledge. Again, this is the second interview we do with Founders Pledge, and there's a good reason to why we want to do a second follow-up. And I'm going to tell you why that is soon, but first, I want to ask you a rhetorical question. So to you who are listening right now, if you would have more money than you could spend, what would you do with that money? Maybe you would donate parts of that to charity. That is what the members of Founders Pledge is doing. They have agreed to sign a legal contract to pledge away part of their money. And so far, they have gathered more than 1,000 members who in total have promised to donate over $2 billion. And to really feel and understand how much $2 billion is, imagine if you would get $100,000 every day to spend for the next 25 years. That is how insanely much $2 billion is. Now also imagine if the world could use that money to solve the most pressing problems like poverty or climate change. Imagine if we could donate $100,000 every day for 25 years to solve poverty. That is what Founders Pledge is all about. And if you want to understand the backstory of Founders Pledge, I recommend you to listen to the previous episode where the founder, David Goldberg, talks about the mindset of effective donations. And in that interview, David said something interesting that we want to follow up on today. David said that COVID-19 is like a wave, or rather a big wave, like an Hawaii wave. But in comparison to climate change, COVID-19 is a small wave because climate change is like a tsunami. And today we want to talk about the topic of climate change. And to do that, we invited John Halstead. And I could think of no better person to talk about around climate change than with John, because John is the head of research for Founders Pledge. And so I want to say, John, welcome to today's conversation and to this interview.
Thanks for having me.
You are at the moment in Oxford?
Yeah, I'm in Oxford. So yeah, I've been locked down for about 4 months now, which, has its ups and downs, but yeah, it's a nice place to be locked down.
It is, right? And that is the same location as Founders Pledge is also based? Is that it?
No, we're based in London, so I usually have to commute in. So that's been one perk of the lockdown, is that I don't have to spend 3 hours getting into London. Yeah, I just live in Oxford because my girlfriend's here.
Now, if I jump directly into my first question here, do you kind of agree with the metaphor that David used to compare COVID-19 and climate change, the big wave versus a tsunami?
Yeah, I think that seems pretty plausible to me. I think COVID reveals lots of interesting things about climate change. So the first thing is that COVID was really not really like a black swan. It wasn't this huge unexpected event. It was more like a grey rhino that people had talked about for many years and then rather predictably happened. So in my last job, I remember reading in the UK National Risk Register, and it said there's this between a 1 in 2 and 1 in 20 chance of a pandemic killing like hundreds of thousands of people. And I said to my boss at the time, I said, wow, that's really high. And he was like, yeah, I know, it's a big deal. And that was in 2015. So I feel like a SARS-like pandemic that we're seeing at the moment is kind of predictable, and we can we should have been better prepared for it, given that I think climate change is this much bigger thing where there's like similarly people are saying like this could do a lot of damage, and there's lots of extreme downside that scientists are telling us about, but the world isn't really changing course at the moment. And I think what COVID has shown is that there are these infrequent events that it's easy to ignore. Like the last time anyone would have experienced a pandemic of this magnitude was in 1918. So almost everyone is dead who would have experienced that. So it's easy to ignore, and it's easy to focus on other problems that are in the news or that happen to be salient to people. Whereas things like pandemics and things like climate change are they're related to problems that are going to be realized in decades, hundreds of years, which shows that we need to kind of be proactive to deal with these things.
So you're basically saying that there was a 50-50% chance that something like this would happen, like COVID-19.
Yeah, in the next, like, if you look at projections that were made a few years ago, like people were saying that a pandemic like this seemed quite likely. Like Bill Gates was sounding the alarm and saying a sort of influenza type or coronavirus pandemic is a very predictable thing, given how like we interact with animals and given how wet markets are in China, and we're not very well prepared for that. And even rich countries, as we're seeing now, aren't very prepared for that. I mean, I wrote a report about global catastrophic risks last year, and I said even rich countries aren't going to be prepared for this, and there's not enough ventilators, and we don't have enough surge capacity. And yeah, so I feel it was a relatively predictable thing that we should have been ready for. The same goes for climate change. The problem is that, like, you know, if you're a politician, the beneficiaries of any action you take are well into the future, so you don't sort of enjoy the political gains you would from something that provides more immediate benefits. So that's something we need to like overcome as a species, really, is like how do we deal with these problems that mainly benefit future generations?
So if we then talk about climate change in compared to COVID-19, did you feel, is there a difference? Did you feel less worried or more worried about climate change after COVID-19 happened? Is there a difference for you, less or more?
Well, one thing people point to is that emissions have fallen. Like that's a very sort of mundane way in which we might be less worried about climate change. But then if you look, emissions haven't really fallen that much. They've fallen to about 2011 levels. And this is in spite of the fact that we're in this really historic recession. People aren't allowed to travel, or like there's very limited travel internally. There's very limited international travel. In spite of that, we're still putting more than 30 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. So I think if you think about the nature of the climate change problem, the real problem with CO2 is that it stays in the atmosphere for a long time. Like a ton of CO2 you emit now is in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. So it's this kind of cumulative problem. If you think about what we're doing with the environment, it's kind of like if you imagine each billion ton we put into the atmosphere is like a brick. And then it's just that you just build this big tower of bricks, and then you stop doing it for 1 year, which is what we're doing. You've still got this big tower of bricks, and you need to sort of figure out how to like stop adding to that forever. That's the problem we face. It's not to like have one-off reductions in CO2. So I'm not that optimistic about it from that end. I think what it might do is drive people to realize that there are these we need to pay attention to global catastrophic risks that aren't salient, but that like can occur if we pay attention to the science. I mean, it's just kind of perfectly analogous, really. The pandemic that we're experiencing at the moment was like scientists were saying, we need to prepare for this, and this seems to be coming, and there's things we could this is going to impose a lot of costs, and any investments we make would be kind of easily paid back by avoiding the costs. And we're seeing that at the moment with trillions of dollars of economic costs, which we could have probably avoided if we'd been more proactive. So I think it might change the mindset of how people think about climate change, in the sense that this is kind of the same. Most of the costs are going to be felt in the future, but we kind of have a responsibility to not ruin the environment for future generations.
And just to clarify what you said there, are you saying that despite COVID and all the changes that's already been done in traveling, we're still emitting 3 billion gigaton? Is that it?
30 billion tons. So yeah, 30 gigatons.
And before COVID, do you know the number?
I think we were at about 36. So it's the biggest, like on the previous year, it's the biggest fall in emissions we've ever had, but it's still a very minor fall. So even though there's been this huge behavior change, and even though people aren't flying, people aren't really driving as much, people aren't like eating out and all this sort of thing, the effect has been quite modest, and we're just back to 2011 levels. And we knew it in 2011 that the emissions were unsustainable. So I think it does illustrate an important truth about climate change, which is that even really demanding lifestyle change isn't going to get us all of the way there. What we really need to do is have this big energy system change, and figure out ways to produce low carbon energy, because yeah, these quite drastic behavior changes have had quite modest effect.
So we could also see this as a test or experiment where the whole world has changed their behavior towards traveling, which has had a significant but still very low effect in the total. So what else then? Well, if changing behavior for the individuals is not going to cut it, then what do you see as solutions or ways to go from here?
Yeah, well, there are historical examples of countries that have decarbonized their electricity systems even while they've enjoyed greater energy consumption and greater economic growth. So in the 1970s, Sweden and France shifted their electricity supply to nuclear and renewables, like a mix, either nuclear and hydro. And then even though their incomes in these countries have increased a lot, living standards have increased a lot, energy demands increased a lot, their emissions have declined substantially. So I think that is the way to tackle the crisis. It's not to focus on reducing energy consumption or on reducing economic growth. I think what we need to do is figure out a way to have prosperous societies that use clean energy. And that's especially true when you consider that most energy demand in the future is going to come outside the West. It's going to come from poorer countries who are trying to economically develop and trying to reduce poverty. And there's this very tight correlation between energy demand and human development. So if, insofar as they want to sort of improve the human development in those countries, they're going to increase energy demand. So what we need to do is figure out a way to avoid them relying on having to rely on fossil fuels to do that. So we need to rely on the low carbon technologies that we have. So we need to increase solar and wind. We need to increase nuclear, carbon capture and storage, and use all of the tools at our disposal. But I think what COVID has illustrated is that focusing on reducing growth is just not that promising. Like even really big recessions don't really do the job, and people don't like recessions. So yeah.
It seems like the only logical way, right, to change the system that is emitting, not the demand for energy. And now if we then put that into relationship with the time frame that we have, so people talk about a carbon bucket, that we have a bucket which is filling up, and we said that we're not going to go beyond 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement. So how close are we to that bucket being full with 1.5 wood?
Yeah, so I mean, we're already past 1 degree. I think you'd have to be like very, very optimistic to think that we'll avoid 1.5 degrees. The IPCC published a report recently on what would be required, and it is like very, very drastic reductions in emissions. So if you think about our emissions kind of on a graph, they've just been sort of steadily trending upwards since the 1800s. You've then just got to like reduce that to 0 within 10 years and then start sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So it's a very big ask, especially given that there's all this already built fossil fuel infrastructure that we need to think about how to decommission and then transition to clean energy sources. So like I'd be very, very surprised if we kept warming to below 1.5 degrees. I'd also be surprised if we kept warming to below 2 degrees. I think, yeah, I'm not completely sure when we'd use up our sort of, the people talk about the carbon budget, but if you look at the 2 degree scenarios, they're like very, very drastic decarbonisation and then getting to negative emissions in the next 30 years. And we have to do this in the context in which, you know, nearly 1 billion people don't have access to electricity. And by the end of the century, the world economy could be like 5 to 10 times larger. And then there'd be 4 billion more people. So there's all these factors that are pushing for more energy demand. And that's traditionally been met by using fossil fuels. In the first instance, countries tend to use coal, and then they transition to cleaner fossil fuels like gas and oil. But we need to avoid the first step. We need to avoid them getting onto fossil fuels in the first place. And it is a really big challenge. I think if we're sort of smart and strategic about how we do it, it is feasible. But I'd still be surprised if we kept warming to below 2 degrees. And then if you look at the pledges and promises that countries have made, with the Paris Agreement, they imply warming of more than 3 degrees. So I think even like pledges that countries have made aren't kind of going to do the job. And yeah, there's reason to think that countries won't keep their pledges. So I think climate policy is kind of not going very well at the moment. So we need to think about ways to make it more effective.
Then let's talk about some of the effects that we're probably going to see, that we're already seeing, and that we're going to see if we reach those targets that we said we're not going to reach. For example, if we reach 1.5 and 2 degrees, can you say something about what is going to actually happen at those points?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I mean, I suppose I'm most worried about the more extreme levels of warming of like more than 4 degrees. But yeah, at 2 degrees, most models suggest that the yields of major food crops are going to decline relative to where they would have been otherwise. Like yields will probably still increase due to productivity, but then they'll take this hit from climate change, which is not good given that you have like increasing demand for food. And yeah, so there's that risk factor. There's definitely concerns once we get to 2 degrees of like rising sea levels and then kind of inundation of coastal areas. And then especially if you look to the very long term, it really is like huge changes to the Earth's surface if we go past 2 degrees. Unless we start doing geoengineering, there's like really multi-meter sea level rises over the course of millennia. I think this fact isn't really considered that much. And then you have to consider droughts and things like that. It's especially going to hit areas in sub-Saharan Africa particularly hard. I think the main worry at that level of warming is basically drying out dry areas and wetter areas getting wetter, and the sort of human costs that has.
I heard Greta Thunberg say that the United Nations are looking to um, a million refugees who are going to seek for shelter and basic needs in other countries by 2050.
Mm-hmm.
So would that be, um, you're saying that if the crops fails, we don't have food, if if we get droughts, we don't have water, and what effects are that going to cause for the political structure of people needing to seek um, refugee in other countries? And yeah,
Yeah.
would that be already an effect at 2 degrees?
It's very hard to predict. I mean, definitely one of the main things I'm worried about with respect to climate change is like climate refugees and mass migration. I think like there is literature sort of suggesting that even recent climate change has driven certain migration flows. Like people say that it contributed to problems of drought in Syria, but then you're really only ever going to get probabilistic attribution there. So you might be able to say climate change increased the probability of this drought happening by this %. So I'm cautious about saying there'd be this many climate refugees. It's very hard to judge. I think at higher levels of warming, you are kind of looking at, it does call into question the habitability of like quite large areas of the planet. Like if we get to 6 degrees, which, you know, on some models is not that unlikely, vast areas of the tropics would be like much less habitable than at present. And then you're thinking, well, there's going to be potentially millions of people on the move, and then there would be huge political problems. It's very hard to say how that would wash out because it's never happened before. But the sign seems like strongly negative. So yeah, I would say like at higher levels of warming, like past 4 degrees, past 6 degrees, you're definitely looking at lots of climate refugees. At 2 degrees, it's a much like at 4 degrees there's like millions and millions of people. At 2 degrees, I think it's less clear, but definitely I think there could be substantial numbers of climate refugees in sub-Saharan Africa and maybe in like low-lying areas like Bangladesh and coastal cities.
So by 4 to 6 degrees, it would be more certain that we probably are going to see those mass refugee kind of floods of people needing to change. But at 2 degrees, it's kind of, we need to be careful to predict because we've never seen this kind of scenario in the world before.
Yeah, I mean, it's just much more clear at 4 degrees. I think that's fair. At 4 degrees or 6 degrees, you're looking at like lots of countries becoming a bit more like Dubai, and there you kind of need air conditioning to be able to sort of live normally. So in lots of countries, you like Pakistan and India, it would be hard to go outside if warming were that high, and then that would probably mean that lots of people would kind of be on the move, and then there'd be international tension from that. So I think that is like my main worry about climate change, is that this heat stress just causes like political turmoil, and we don't really have the international institutions to deal with that at the moment.
Clarify, what would that look like to have those international institutions?
Well, you saw it with the refugee crisis in the European Union. Like the European Union is supposed to be something that kind of manages the international crises like this, but there was no sharing of the burden of refugees across countries. So certain countries received a lot of refugees, like Italy and Hungary, and then this caused like lots of anti-refugee sentiment in these countries and created political tensions between those recipient countries and other countries that had less of a burden. And then, yeah, like there just seems to be this dynamic of voters not liking accepting a lot of refugees, and that's happened in Germany to some extent, the far right rising as a result of that. But it would be that on a much bigger scale, because there'd be potentially millions and millions of people on the move, and then it's kind of the UN doesn't have any systems in place to be able to deal with that. Like at present, we basically pay countries in low and middle income countries to take refugees, like European countries and others pay Turkey to take refugees from Syria. And I think similar things happen in Africa. It's just whether that would be sustainable when the number of people is like an order of magnitude higher. It seems like hard to know how we would actually deal with that.
So the tension would be the tension building up for every degree we're increasing. That is one of the main concerns. Is that what you're saying? That is really something that we should be take seriously in this.
Yeah, I mean that's my main concern. There's a good book recently been published called 6 Degrees by Mark Linus, where he goes into the impact of different levels of warming, each degree of warming, what happens at each degree. And yeah, like this heat stress factor does seem to be a really important thing that we're like not set up to deal with at all at the moment.
Can you recite part of that, what happens at 3 degrees, 4, 5, 6, and is it even a point to talk about higher than 6?
Yeah, well, so I suppose I've looked most at what he says about like beyond 4. At 2, it's kind of, I suppose, similar to where we are now with more droughts and more deadly heat waves. And then when you're getting to 4 degrees, this heat stress thing starts to be a concern, and there would start to be habitability questions in some of the tropical countries. So that's the point at which you're starting to worry about mass migration from drought and from heat stress. And then at 6 degrees, like he discusses in some depth whether that could like make us extinct. And there's this debate in the scientific literature about whether that there could be like a runaway greenhouse effect like they have on Venus and all the oceans boil off. Or there's this more moderate thing called moist greenhouse where the surface of the earth would basically be sanitized and we would go extinct, and the water would be stripped off from the earth. And he argues that it's kind of like possible, but probably like pretty unlikely that could happen, but it's not a risk that we'd want to impose on ourselves. I mean, we're emitting, like the rate of emissions now is much faster than it has been at any point in history, really. So this is a bit of an experiment that we're doing, and that brings risks of its own. And then like if we really go to the higher ends of emissions, like going past 6 degrees, he thinks there is this small risk of us becoming extinct. I don't know, maybe I'm like more optimistic than him about that, but definitely we want to avoid 6 degrees just for all the political reasons that we've discussed. So yeah, I'm not sure whether I completely buy into the idea that we're going to go extinct this century or something like that. Like 6 degrees will probably happen next century, so it does give us more time to adapt, but it'd still be kind of extremely bad. Yeah.
If I change direction a little bit here, I listen also to another thing that Greta Thunberg says, and I refer to her because I just assume that she has a lot of evidence-based, like people who are really smart to help her when she's talking.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that the political system, we're not going to solve climate change in the political system, because all the agreements that already have been made of the future emissions that is about to come in the next 5-10 years, they're so locked in because it's a law agreement. And unless we find a way to just rip those apart, it's just going to continue. The production in the same system is just continuing the emissions. So is that your worldview as well, that we're kind of stuck in a situation where our current political system is blocking us from solving it, but we're trusting the current political system to also solve it, which is impossible?
Mm-hmm. I'm maybe a bit more optimistic than that, but not that not particularly optimistic, I suppose. Yeah, I suppose the only way you could change the political system to make it more proactive on climate change would be to have some mechanism to incorporate the interests of future generations, and that's quite difficult to do and execute. Some countries have tried. They've had I think potentially Sweden had a minister for future generations, but it's hard for them to have a lot of influence. So yeah, there's that side of things, and then maybe like some people say we need to change the economic system and maybe we need to get rid of capitalism or something like that, which seems sort of difficult and sort of, I suppose, B, undesirable insofar as you think like capitalism does sort of put food on the table for lots of people. It has excesses in the case of climate change, but we need to figure out how to deal with those issues. And then I think there's two broad ways you might think about solving climate change within those constraints. So I think the first one is if rich countries kind of get their act together, if Biden wins and imposes some serious climate policy in the US and the EU starts to have more serious climate policy, maybe then you can have what economists call a climate club. So you have basically tariffs on carbon intensive imports. So if there's factories in China that produce lots of CO2 to produce steel, then there's a tax on that, which incentivizes China to reduce their own CO2 emissions. And that could be a way to solve this big global collective action problem, which has stopped serious action on climate change. If you have enough, if the major powers are serious enough to do something like that, I think that could cause a major shift in the trajectory that we're on. The other way that we could affect emissions in developing countries, which are going to be most of emissions in the future and are most emissions now, is through making clean technology cheap. So this is the sort of, I suppose, the technological approach to solving climate change. And there's an example of that. Germany and China have subsidized solar panels a lot. And that's driven down the cost of solar panels over the last few decades. So as a result of that, this technology, it's not just emissions reductions in Germany and China. What that's driven is emissions. It gives the whole world low carbon technology that they can then use. And you can see a similar thing with electric cars. So California and Norway have various ways of incentivizing electric cars. So they mandate that producers have to sell a certain number of electric cars, or they you get kind of credits for selling electric cars if you're a producer. And then Elon Musk has exploited that and kind of set up Tesla, and that has this that's helped to drive down the cost of electric cars a lot. And what that does is gives this low carbon technology, it makes this low carbon technology available for poorer countries. So you can see India is mandating that car sales, I think in 2030 have to be electric cars. So that's 10% of emissions is light duty transport, something on that order. So that's another way of doing it. So you've got the kind of political trade-based solution, and then you've got the technological solution. And yeah, I'm kind of optimistic about both. And I think that as long as like the environmental activists and philanthropists think strategically and carefully about what has actually worked and what's going to succeed in the future, I think those could potentially be good ways forward. And we've, like at Founders Pledge, we've looked at charities that are advocating for this like carbon tariff approach, which I think could be game changing, but it's maybe a bit too early in the US, where like lots of the Republicans are climate skeptics. So yeah.
Let's see if I can summarize what you just said there. So
Yeah.
to take away capitalism would probably lead to people not having food on their tables, and that's going to increase other kind of problems. So instead, how can we, within the current system, either add some kind of tariff when we're emitting carbon dioxide, or can we create a technology that other countries can replicate so that we have a we kind of I don't find the word I'm looking for, but we have a clean energy. I guess that's what you're saying, to just replicate in a big enough scale so that we make it in time until we reach that point.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's kind of like making clean energy cheap enough and good enough so that people in developing countries want to use it anyway, and making it competitive with the current kind of polluting alternatives, which is like, yeah, electric cars and solar power are big success stories on that front. And we need to do that for all the other technologies that we need as well. And to find ways to make cheap hydrogen, make carbon capture and storage cheap, make negative emissions cheap, make wind power cheap, potentially make nuclear power cheap. That's one lever we can pull. The other one is this trade-based thing. I suppose one other option would be like policy leadership. So demonstrating that certain policies are effective. I think the dynamic that's been seen over the last 30 years is that economists say a carbon tax is the best way to deal with this. It's the most efficient way to deal with it, and that's what we should do. And then the sort of that's kind of bumped into the political realities, and carbon taxes either haven't been imposed, as we've seen in the US, like on the federal level, or they have been really low. Like the global average carbon price is like less than $10 per ton, which is really low. But some countries have crafted a more pragmatic approach, and they've like combined like smarter regulations, more efficient regulations with carbon pricing, and that's allowed them to decarbonize. That's kind of what's happened in the UK. Like emissions have fallen a lot in the UK recently as a result of carbon pricing, like modest carbon pricing, and also regulations, like flexible regulations. And the thought is maybe that kind of policy leadership could be applied in developing countries. And they say like, this seems to be like a politically feasible way of decarbonizing the economy. So that would be another route where you could actually decarbonize emerging economies.
Could you clarify what you said about the UK economy has been able to reduce the emissions? How has that been possible, and how much are we talking about?
Yeah, well, they're now very low. I think they're sort of lower than they have been since the 19th century. They recently passed that threshold, and that's basically as a result of aggressively trying to retire the coal fleet. And you can do that with they set a carbon price floor, which is sort of producing coal really expensive. And they've also kind of done various imposed various regulations, which have made like running coal just not profitable. So they've sent this clear signal to the market that we're getting coal off the grid and retiring coal. And then that's been replaced by gas, which is less polluting, and also by biomass and by renewables, and we're also building more nuclear. So I think it's kind of an example of climate success, I suppose. We've really reduced emissions quite a lot, and we're now, like, emissions per head in the UK, I think, are on the order of like 6 tons per person or something like that, which is quite low in the context of high income countries, and is lower than some middle income countries, like it may be lower than China. I'd have to check that, but like there's other, like in South Africa, countries like that are much poorer, but have higher emissions, but have quite high emissions per head.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Can I ask you then, is there a terminology or aspects of climate change that you would like for more people to understand? Is there anything that you think would be necessary for us as a population to understand about this phenomenon?
Yeah, I suppose the main thing would be that the atmosphere is a bit like a bathtub. Like that would be my number one thing for people to understand. And I think even kind of undergraduates who are studying it don't necessarily understand that that's how it is. And what I mean by that is that like in normal times, the removals of CO2 and additions from CO2 are in balance. So the trees grow and they sequester CO2, and then they die, and then they release the CO2, and then they grow again. And there's this kind of this saw-like pattern that you see in atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And then that balance is kind of upset by anthropogenic emissions. So once you start burning fossil fuels, there's then this kind of imbalance in the system. And the CO2 that leaves your car exhaust goes into the atmosphere and stays there for more than 1,000 years, like about 40% stays there for more than 1,000 years. And that CO2 is removed from the system over a very long time period. So what that means is that as long as the tap of emissions is on, the bathtub continues to fill up, CO2 concentrations continue to rise. So the challenge we face is not like to turn the tap down, it's not to reduce emissions from where they were last year, it's to sort of turn the tap off. So there have to be like no emissions from planes, trains, ships, cars, power plants, or industry. So I think that gives an idea of the scale of what we've got to do. Is this just huge technological, political challenge? So yeah, that would be the main thing. I'd kind of want people to understand that the atmosphere is like a bathtub and we have to turn the tap off.
So it's more important to turn the tap off than to take a bucket and try to get
oh well, yeah, there is that as well. I mean, if we start removing CO2 from the atmosphere, which we could do with negative emissions technology, then we wouldn't necessarily have to get to zero emissions. But the problem with that is that it seems expensive at the moment. So if you look at most scenarios, we're looking at kind of decarbonizing electricity, decarbonizing, and then electrifying lots of the economy. So, you know, that's more than half of emissions. And then we have to think about how do we decarbonize cement, steel, and chemicals. And that's like a big fraction of emissions. It's really hard to decarbonize, which is about 20%. And then we have to start doing negative emissions if you want to avoid like going past 2 degrees. But yeah, like looking to the future, we need like zero emissions electricity, zero emissions transport. It's a really big challenge. Like if we built one of the largest nuclear plants ever every week for the next 20 years, it would still take it would take 20 years to replace the current stock of coal-fired power stations. So that gives an idea of like the magnitude of the challenge that we have.
Just to clarify again, are you saying that it's more probably at this stage time, is it more effective to try to turn off the tap? That's a smaller challenge than to try to get the polluted air or the polluted CO2 away from the bathtub.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Now, I'm thinking for us to start to end this interview today, and I would like to do that by doing a scenario kind of game where If you imagine yourself in 5 different scenarios, how would you have dealt with that scenario? Are you up
Okay.
to play that small game?
Yeah. Let's do it.
So I'm going to give you the first scenario here is if you if you were an individual who didn't have space to think about climate change,
Mm-hmm.
um, what would you do then?
Is that what would I like? What other problem would I work on? Or
So basically, you acknowledge that climate change, yes, we need to solve it, but
mm,
at the time right now, I don't have space in my life to think about it. I just need to continue my life because it's already I have enough to deal with.
mm.
Uh, would you do anything anyways? Is there anything that a person like that could do in that situation? I don't have time to invest into thinking about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
What would you do?
Oh right, yeah. I think I would. Um, like I like one thing is voting for environmentally friendly politicians. If I was in America, I think it was like very important for me to vote for Biden and yeah, advocate for that and trying to get the Republicans to shift their stance, their climate skeptic stance would be one thing. Another thing would be donating. I think is really important. People don't often think about when they're thinking about climate friendly decisions that they can make. But then you have to be really careful about what you donate because I think there's really big differences between charities in terms of the impact they have. So read Founders Pledge research would be my advice on that front. If you're looking for somewhere to donate, yeah, so we have 2 recommended climate charities. I'd probably increase that over the next few months. But yeah, I'd probably look at donating to our charities.
And I want to highlight one of those is Clean Air Task Force.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one, right? And they would then work with extracting carbon from there, right? So they're trying to solve this challenge by just taking down what we already released.
There's an aspect of that. I think they're working on many like parts of the problem. So they advocate for like climate legislation in the US, like pragmatic climate legislation, and they try to support neglected low carbon energy technologies like carbon capture and nuclear and zero carbon fuels. So you're kind of funding an advocacy campaign that has some probability of paying off. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So that was the first scenario. If you don't have that much time to think about climate change.
Yeah.
Now, if you did have time, but you don't know where to start, you were talking about donations. Would that be a recommendation or anything else if you did want to invest more time? What would you do?
Yeah, I think like learning about the problem would be a good place to start. And yeah, learning about the problem and learning about the solutions. I could recommend various books that people could read. I suppose we're trying to condense them into one report in our new climate report, which should be done in around September. And yeah, I think if you want to take action, as I said for the previous question, I do that. If you wanted to learn more, there's lots of great books out there. Like Climate Shock is a great book by Gernot Wagner. There's 6 Degrees by Mark Linus. David Mackay, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. So I think there's lots of good books out there where you can kind of learn more.
I'll make sure to link down in this episode. So if you want to check those out, I'll link those in this episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, the third scenario then. Let's say that you are an individual now that is highly worried and you recognize the problem. Now you wanna go all in for the climate. You really want to bet your life on this. What would you do?
Yeah, so then I suppose you'd be looking at, one option would be earn lots of money and then donate. So like think about ways you could like make lots of money without of course doing harm while doing that. Another option would be, I suppose, working for like running for office would be one, like getting involved in politics. which I suppose is especially valuable in places where there's resistance to climate action, like the US. And then another one would be working for effective non-profits. So like getting a job at the Clean Air Task Force or the Environmental Defence Fund or something like that. But then I suppose it depends how early on you are in your career. And yeah, there's I suppose lots of ways you could approach that. Like you could go into energy systems modeling. You could get a legal background and work on some like climate legislation type stuff. So yeah, those would be the main paths that I'd explore.
The fourth scenario, so thank you, that was the three first. So the fourth one is, if you were a teenager today, what would you do?
Yeah, if I was a teenager interested in climate change, I think I'd probably get a quantitative degree, would be my advice. Like I say this as someone who did philosophies for a PhD, which is not quantitative, obviously. But I think that gives you more options. So if you did something like climate economics, or if you did climate physics, I think that gives you more scope to like have a big influence in your career when you decide what to do. And then even if you wanted to earn lots of money, like there's lots of jobs for people who are quantitatively minded. And then I think when you're that young, just like you should spend a lot of time reading and thinking about what the right way to tackle things is. I think a big problem in climate is that lots of people are worried about it, but they're not sure what to do about it. So you need to think really, really carefully about how can I actually use my time to have the most impact on this problem. And not much of that goes on. I think people are motivated, but then like spend their time sort of advocating for things that aren't necessarily the most impactful way to approach it, or even might be like detrimental to the cause. So yeah, I'd like make lots of efforts to try and be rational about the problem and to learn a lot.
Okay, thank you. The last question is, if you would be a politician that felt that you actually have some kind of power to do some kind of change, what would you do with that kind of power?
I suppose it would depend where I am. If I was in the US, I suppose it depends how much power I've got. But how much power do I have in this situation? How constrained am I?
You're not a top dog who really can make the decisions. You're not, but you're in the hierarchy where you can actually affect people who's going to see how you tackle the situation.
Yeah. It would. I think it would depend a bit where I am. So if I was in Europe, I think like electricity emissions. So if I was a politician in the UK, electricity emissions are already quite constrained. Like there's sort of limits on how much the UK can emit just because we have climate targets, and that's true in other European countries. That we're in the European Emissions Trading Scheme, so there's kind of limits on how much the electricity sector can emit in a given year. So I probably wouldn't focus on that. I'd probably focus on either advocating for the carbon tariffs idea that I mentioned before, which the EU is looking into at the moment, as a way to kind of spur international action on climate, or I would focus on supporting neglected low carbon technologies. So I'd figure out ways to, I think the most important neglected ones are probably carbon capture and storage, advanced nuclear, and then cheap ways to make zero carbon fuels like hydrogen. So I'd be like advocating amongst my colleagues to push for like research funding for those, and also like making a market for those products